Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about social religious reform movements in the 19th century. As we know that during this particular period, some of the social religious reform leaders, they played an important role in terms of talking about certain ideas with regard to the Indian society, where they wanted to reform certain existing evils in the society. For that matter, some of them which were related to women was that sati was being practiced in certain areas, or widow remarriage was not allowed, or child marriages which were happening. And apart from that, one of the concerns was polygamy with regard to women. And in the context of the caste, we find that there was a lot of discrimination. So some of the social religious reform movement leaders, they presented their ideas in a way that how reforms could be brought about in the society. And for that matter, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, they played an important role in the 19th century with regard to the reforms. And historians also, they have tried to understand this phenomena within a particular framework of impact response scheme, for that matter, because as some of the scholars, they argued that social religious reform movements, they were initiated in response to the British policies. So in the course of our discussion, we will try to in a way understand and assess these social reform movements and the kind of impact they were able to create on the masses, and the kind of reforms as well as the laws which were being brought to tackle them. In the context of readings, one can refer Kenneth W. Jones, Social Religious Reform Movements in British India, B.L. Grover's A New Look at Modern Indian History, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay is From Palasi to Partition, History of Modern India, Amia P. Sen, edited Social and Religious Reform, The Hindus of British India, NCERT and IGRU source material. So all these one can refer when one is talking about the idea of reform. And it is also, when you talk about the social religious reform movements, we also find that how there are connections between the religious beliefs and the social practices. And when one is talking in framework of India, we find that the religious reformation was a necessary prerequisite for the social change as well. And we find that during this time, caste system and emancipation of women, these were the two major areas in which reforms they were being talked about. And as we are also aware that was also the period when India was under the colonial rule. And when India was under the colonial rule, then we find that some kind of a struggle was also there with regard to the issues of culture. And we find that national consciousness was another important concern of that particular period. And when you talk about the cultural ideological struggle, then reform movements, they were trying to invoke some kind of national consciousness. And it was because of the fact as well that how the movement was able to bring about initial intellectual and the cultural break, which made a new vision of the future possible. And secondly, it was part of a resistance against the colonial cultural and ideological hegemony as well. So we find that some of the British officials, they were also instrumental in terms of bringing about legislation for this. And we find that one of them who was influenced by the utilitarian philosophy, and who was also instrumental in abolishing sati and the child infanticide through legislation, was Lord Banting. And we also see that he retained in a way faith in the Indian traditions and cited the ancient Hindu texts as scriptural logic in the abolition of sati. So in that sense, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, they also cited the Hindu texts as well, that how Hindu texts, they were not in any way talking about sati. And the first references of sati in India, they are only found in the 6th century AD. So we do not find that any references with regard to sati, they were there in the ancient times at all. And that was 6th century is the first reference, and it was not also very popular in that sense or widespread in all the regions of India. but the way it existed and the kind of evil it was being considered then, we find that the social religious reform movement leaders, they definitely played an important role in terms of making people aware about such kind of inhuman customs. And when we talk about reformers, we find that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was against Sati, and he started various other organizations like Atmiya Sabha in 1814, Brahma Samaj in 1828, and prohibition on idolatry and sacrifice, which is he talked about, and his concept of deity, the eternal, unsearchable and immutable being, who is the author and preserver of the universe. So we find that Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was well versed in various languages, who knew English, Persian, Bengali, Hebrew and so many others, and at the same time he had that rational bent of mind where he could realize that some of the customs which had crept in the society, especially during the medieval ages as well, so how these customs they have to be done away with. And he realized that when people, they will be made aware about the irrelevance of such kind of customs, then only we will be able to eradicate them. We also find that when one is talking about the various kinds of movements which were launched in the 19th century with regard to the social religious reforms, we find that Kenneth Jones talks about the social religious dissent produced two types of movement, transitional and acculturative. And transitional movements, they had origins in the pre-colonial world, and they arose from the indigenous forms of social religious dissent with little or no influence from colonial milieu. And it also had the absence of anglicized individuals among its leaders and the lack of concern with adjusting its concepts and programs to the colonial world. So we find that how transitional movements basically were in a way located in the pre-colonial times, and they were also in a way, we find that the people, those who were associated with these movements, anglicized individuals, they were there, they were not there in the transitional movements, and they were also not in a way more concerned in that sense to adjust their concepts, their programs to the colonial period. And on the other hand, we find that there were other movements like acculturative, which originated with the colonial milieu and led by the individuals who were products of cultural interaction, for example Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and they were seeking an accommodation to the fact of the British supremacy to the colonial milieu that such supremacy had created, and to the personal position of its members within the colonial world as well. So at the point of origin, we find that these movements, they had the kind of differences which we find, and we find that acculturative movements, they were in a way result of the cultural interaction which was happening at that point of time. When we talk about the various kinds of movements which were launched at that point of time, especially the Brahmo Samaj, which was an acculturative movement, and how it reinterpreted Hinduism during that particular period, and how the Western organizational forms of a voluntary religious association with congregational meetings, society offices, printed literature, bank account, all of them we find that it could be found in the Brahmo Samaj. And Brahmo Samaj definitely made some kind of a leeway in the society, where we find that so many people from different sections of the society, they joined Brahmo Samaj. And later we find that some kind of a tension between Debendranath Tagore and Keshav Chandra Sen over Tagore's decision to allow those conducting services to wear sacred thread could be found. And Sen organized the Brahmo Samaj of India after that, and Tagore group called itself Adi Brahmo Samaj. So in that framework, we find that there was some kind of a division within the Samaj. And later again, we find that when Keshav Chandra Sen announced the marriage of his daughter to Maharaja of Cooch Behar, which violated the Brahmo Marriage Act of 1872 because of her age, and proposed the use of idolatrous rituals, then again it led to some kind of a split, and this led to the founding of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. So we find that how the people, those who were associated with the Brahmo Samaj, and the people, those who were in a way concerned with the practices of Brahmo Samaj, they were also evolving, and at the same time when such kind of evolution did not meet the aspirations of the Samaj, then we find that there were splits in the Samaj, and because of which new kinds of organizations which were directly in a way concerned with Samaj, Brahma Samaj, but at the same time having different kinds of ideas, they also emerged. We also see during this particular period that some of the thinkers or the people, those who have also been witness to the revolt of 1857, like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, he believed that the English society's discipline, order, efficiency and high levels of education along with science and technology must be adopted by the Muslim community. And Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in 1875, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University for Education, was also established by him. And he was also against the parda of women. So we find that some people, they talked about the education of the Muslim community, and Sayyid Ahmad Khan in a way organized one college for the Muslim community, which later became a university as well. And some of the rational ideas which he possessed were in the context of parda of women, which he rejected. Apart from that, we also see that some of the thinkers of this time, for example Swami Dayanand, who talked about go back to Vedas and who talked about the infallibility of Vedas, and he initiated Arya Samaj in 1875. We find that he also initiated the Shuddhi movement to purify and readmit Hindus who had converted to Islam or Christianity. So in that sense, we find that the leaders, those who were associated with the various kinds of movements, and Arya Samaj definitely made a lot of impact in different regions of India. And Dayanand, for that matter, again was a rationalist in that sense that he was not in favor of any idol worship. He was also rejecting the child marriages which were happening in the society, or any kind of elaborate rituals. He did not favor them, and he was also in a way not talking about the Brahmin priests. So in that sense, Dayanand was talking about the kind of changes which have to come in the society. And at the same time, we also see that when one is talking about the Shuddhi movement, where the people, those who had the Hindus, those who had already converted to Islam or Christianity, they could in a way come back to the fold of Hinduism. So he launched movement with regard to that as well. And apart from that, in terms of education, we find that the kind of divisions which were there within the Samaj, where one was the Gurukul wing, which stressed the religious nature of the Samaj and stressed on the strict vegetarianism. On the other hand, we had the college party. It saw Dayanand as a great reformer, but not as a divinely inspired rishi, and saw vegetarianism as an issue of personal choice. So we find that different kinds of ideas, they were there or persisted within the ranks of Samaj as well. And their opinions in that sense, the people, those who were believing, for example, Dayanand as a divinity, and there were others like college party, those who just saw him as a reformer. And even on the issue of vegetarianism, we find that college party believed that it was a matter of personal choice. We also see that apart from the movements which we have already discussed, there were several others as well. For example, Tariq-e-Muhammadiyya, Sayyid Ahmad Khan Barelvi or Abdul Aziz, and they talked about the removal of erroneous innovations, all elements of polytheism and idolatry which were there, and they attempted to re-establish the Islamic supremacy through war, and thus to elevate the entire Muslim community. And they also talk within the framework of jihad against the British as well. So we find that these kinds of movements, they were talking within the framework of jihad, that how some kind of a religious war should be launched against the British. And they in a way wanted to create some kind of a Islamic supremacy through war, and they were talking about Darul Islam instead of Darul Harb, which was being there when the British had come. So initially we find that these kinds of ideas which were there in some of the movements which were launched. Apart from that, we also see another transitional movement, Swaminarayan Sampradaya, with its Brahmin leadership, and it limited the criticism of Hinduism and emphasized on a reinforced moral code. And it belongs in part to the past pattern of bhakti as well as tradition of social protest. So we find that some of the transitional movements like Swaminarayan Sampradaya, they were emphasizing on the moral code of the people, and at the same time we find that they were also emphasizing on the bhakti as well as the idea of social protest as well. And how this movement also gained momentum in different parts of India, and how Swaminarayan Sampradaya had different temples in different regions of India. In the context of the idea of the scholars, that how they have tried to define the social religious reform movements and how they have seen these movements, we find that they understood the social and the religious reform as a series of reflexes produced by unique intellectual challenges posed by the West. And we find that this was the idea which was in the context of the impact response scheme. And when one is talking about the social religious reform movements, then we will find that the kind of challenges which were posed by the West, then the social religious reform movements, they were just in a way providing its reflex or reaction to them. We also see the people, those who were talking about these kinds of ideas, they had two assumptions. And one was that they assumed that the rational utilitarian critique of the indigenous society and religion was not possible or absent in the pre-modern India. And they also say that the historical experiences of Europe could be replicated in India. So these were the two assumptions of the people, those who were talking within that particular framework. And we find that how the historical experiences of Europe, it was very difficult to replicate them in India. Rather, for that matter, historical experiences of one region, for that matter, are very difficult to replicate in another region. But here it are two different continents or countries they were being talked about. And we find that there were the scholars, those who have talked about these kinds of ideas, and J.N. Farquhar says that the very category of reform was born in the intellectual stimulus which was provided by the West. And other scholars like R.C. Majumdar, they say that only 40 years of English education had brought about greater changes in fellow Bengalis than had been possible in previous 1000 years. So scholars, they have tried to see that how the introduction of English education had transformed the society as well. And English education, along with the various kinds of ideas which were associated with the English education, whether in the framework of rationalism or humanism, which it talked about. But we also find that these kinds of things which were being preached within the context of India, and the education which was being provided to the Indians was there only to make them clerks. And the aim of the education was only in the framework that how they are able to follow the British culture. And this following of the British culture would only be possible when Indians, they will be trained in the English language, when the English traditions, customs, practices, they will be made known to them. And that is how we find that when the English education was introduced through the Minute on Education in 1835 by Lord Macaulay, and how the supporters of this education, including Macaulay, were critics of the Asian system of education, or even the Asian languages as well, because they wanted that vernacular education should not be given to the Indians, rather education in English should be given to the Indians. So their focus was in this particular sense as well. And we also find that some of the scholars like D.S. Sarma, they see the 19th century Renaissance as nothing unique, but only one in a series of successive developments in Indian history. So they have argued that it was not unique, it was not the result of any kind of a position or any kind of a development because of the British position in that sense, but the kind of developments which were happening in the Indian society. So in that sense, this Renaissance was also in that particular series where successive developments were happening in the Indian society. And he has in a way seen Renaissance not with the early figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, but with the late 19th century mystic Sri Ramakrishna. So scholars, they have in a way tried to see the situation from their own perspective, and they have in a way tried to give an idea about that particular period, and they have also tried to interpret that particular period from their own particular perspectives. And when one is talking about the various kinds of issues within the society of that particular period, we find that these kinds of movements were very relevant within the framework of even contemporary times. And when one is talking about the women's emancipation or the caste system, we find that they have been relevant at all times, and even after 75 years of independence, we talk about such kind of issues quite now and then. And when one is talking about the reform movements, they are generally spoken with reference to the ideas of rationalism or the ideas of the kind of reforms which were to be brought about at that point of time. And we find that when one is talking about these kinds of ideas, they were there even during the ancient times in India, whether you see Jainism or Buddhism or the texts which were written within the Hindu fold or Hinduism. We find that all of them, they preach the ideas of rationality and humanism. So they were not new in that sense, but over a period of time, we find that the society, especially during the medieval period, and the society became more static in nature, or rather more backward in that sense, because many of the things which were there during the ancient period, whether the status of women or the idea of distinctions which were there in the society, they were not all that sharp in that sense, which we find during this particular period. So we find that such kind of movements which were being launched during this particular period, they were also some sort of an inspiration for the later movements as well. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. We'll continue further in our next lecture. Thank you very much.